Now, this week, Western leaders are expected to step up sanctions on Russia, and it's reported that NATO has agreed to send tanks to Ukraine. Well, joining me in the studio now to discuss Ukraine, but also the 40th anniversary of the Falklands War, is Conservative MP for Romford, Andrew Rosindell. Welcome to the programme. I suppose, listening to that conversation with Alexei, there are parallels. There's always been the battles for freedom, for liberty, for justice. There have always been the fascistic aggressors in this world and those fighting for liberty. Do you see parallels between what happened in the Falklands 40 years ago and what's going on in Ukraine now?
Tom, history repeats itself, sadly. It seems like we don't learn from what's gone before. 40 years ago, the Argentines invaded the Falkland Islands. It was an act of illegal aggression against the people there. And it's tragic. And we just heard what our friend from Ukraine was saying, how appalling to see these acts of violence against innocent people yet again in a different context. The point I'd like to make is that when freedom is threatened, and when bullies need to be stood up to, I think it's Britain that's almost always there first with America and with our NATO allies. And 40 years ago, Mrs. Thatcher showed that Britain was not going to allow the Falkland Islands to be taken by conquest. She made sure that we sent a task force to recapture those islands, to give the British Falklanders the right to determine their own destiny. And we must learn from those lessons today with Ukraine. We simply have to stand up to bullying, and this is what it is. It's wickedness that's going on in Ukraine. We're hearing about the awful atrocities that are being discovered. I mean, it is just shocking in this day and age that these kind of things are taking place. And Britain must stand firm with our allies against it and learn from previous incidents. And today we remember the Falklands, and I hope that all British people will also remember it, because I think in many ways, it gave Britain a sense of purpose again. You know, we weren't in a good way before 1982, and the Falklands really gave us something to stand up for again. And I think we've had generally a successful 40 years ever since Mrs. Thatcher took that difficult decision to send the task force and recapture the islands.
It is fascinating to see how the UK was viewed in the world before then, even viewed internally in this country, this sense of managed decline since the end of the war, where Prime Minister after Prime Minister, no matter which party, frankly, saw their role as just managing the decline of this country, trying to make our exit from the world stage as graceful as possible. Well, the Falklands, to some extent, turned that around. Suddenly, the UK, which was seen as a power where other countries felt like they could take bits off, especially the Argentines. We turned that round. We stepped back up to the global sphere. We were back up there in the big decision-making bodies of the world. And clearly, that spirit has lived on today when we're hearing Ukrainians thank the United Kingdom for really leading the fight there. I suppose that wouldn't have happened without the Falklands.
Tom, you're completely right. I think that the Falkland Islands was a turning point. That conflict was a turning point. But I think it only was because he had a particular Prime Minister at the time who understood that if we'd given in, if we'd allowed a military dictatorship to capture the Queen's Islands, which is what they were, if we'd allowed that to happen, I think that Britain would have been diminished beyond imagination. We'd have lost our way completely. And she knew that everything depended on that. And she had to fight the global community, as always, looking for a peace solution, even though aggression has taken place. And I don't believe in that. I think that if aggression has taken place, you have to stand up to those people. You can't let them win. And she was absolutely clear that we couldn't let Argentina win. Had we not done that then, had our magnificent armed forces not sailed all those miles to the Falklands, rescued the people of the Falkland Islands, not only would Britain have been diminished, but the democracy we now see in Latin America would never have occurred. And I think we'd have unleashed dictatorships around the world to capture lands and territories and islands that they thought was theirs. So Mrs. Thatcher, we owe a huge debt of gratitude for, not only for rescuing the Falklands, restoring pride to Britain, but also helping to bring freedom and democracy around the world, which culminated in the fall of the Berlin Wall, at the end of the Cold War. If only we we had more leaders like that today.
Well, I wonder, looking at those parallels to today, because clearly that resolve to not appease aggressors, that's been present within the United Kingdom. Since 2015, we were training Ukrainian armed forces. We've trained over 22,000 of them. We were sending defensive weaponry, anti-tank missiles as early as January. All the while, countries like Germany were steadily importing more Russian oil and gas and refusing to send weaponry to Ukraine. Is there a difference in mindset here? Are we as a people more likely now to stand up to those aggressors?
Well, actually, Tom, you've hit on something very important to me, because one of the reasons I wanted to leave the European Union is because they have great ambitions, to have a European defence and sideline NATO. I frankly don't think that the European countries in general, there are some exceptions, but Germany in particular, they simply look after their own interests. Now, we make huge sacrifices to defend the freedom of other countries. We've done that for generations. My father fought in the Royal Air Force. My grandfathers fought in the First World War in the army. We know in this country what it's like to fight and die for freedom. Generations have done this. And we not only do it to defend our own people, but other people as well. We have a proud record as a nation. And I think that what really worries me is that future generations don't always understand this. They're being fed a lot of woke stuff in schools and told almost to dislike their own country. And I really do think that that's a big problem today, in making sure young people understand this.
I've been struck by the media when it comes to the reporting of this conflict. We hear today about how the Ukrainian people are supporting Britain. We see opinion polls, remarkably conducted within Ukraine, that show the popularity of the United Kingdom compared to other countries. We see the speech from President Zelensky just yesterday, who condemned Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy for their appeasement of Russia, and explicitly praised the United Kingdom Prime Minister. Why on earth is the media not reporting the true facts on the ground there in terms of how the Ukrainian people see the United Kingdom? All I see from so many newspapers and broadcasters is how bad the United Kingdom is and how little we're doing, when the opposite seems to be the case in the minds of the Ukrainian people.
Tom, I wish I knew. I find it atrocious that so many people, particularly in the media, not GBNews, of course, but many in the media, always seem to be downgrading Britain's contribution, not actually giving Britain the credit for what we always do, which is to stand up for freedom and democracy and the rights of people. And yes, I think it's appalling that we're not ensuring that the British people understand this, because too many people seem to have a downer on our own country. And this is going to lead us nowhere. This is going to lead to division within our own society if this carries on. And so, as I said earlier, those people in the media, in the establishment, in the educational establishment particularly, who seem to be looking for ways of beating up Britain and doing Britain down, rather than promoting the incredible force for good in the world that we are and always have been. These people are really harming our country and teaching our younger people to dislike their own nation. And I do think that we as politicians, and I know that GBNews is always promoting Britain and standing up for the truth about what a success we are as a country, I think we need to do more of this and shout more loudly.
Oh, absolutely. While we, of course, believe in speaking about the uncomfortable truths that there are contemporarily and historically, there also has to be space for speaking up for the good that we have done and are doing in the world. Andrew Rosindell, thank you so much for joining us here this afternoon on The Briefing.